Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you may be joining us from. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined here with Ben Escobedo and Jin Liang Shaboun, our pro Shure market development team, as you know. Today we're talking about workflow webinar series, Networking Your Wireless. It's the second installment of our workflow series. Thanks for joining us. Without further ado, y'all, I think we should dive in here and introduce our guests for today's webinar on Networking Your Wireless. So we got quite the lineup today. Some of you guys know each other, some of you don't. Kicking it off this morning, we've got Steve Vaughn of Soundtronics Wireless. Steve Vaughn, you want to pop in and say hello? There he is.
Hello, everybody. How you doing?
Hey, Steve.
Next up,
Actually,
we've
your
got
audio
Bill
changed a
Kappleman,
little bit for what.
lead A2 for Jimmy Kimmel and some others.
Hey, Bill.
Hey, everybody.
And Steve Anderson.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hey, Steve.
Coming out of nowhere. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Kelly Epperson from Easy Live Audio.
Hello.
Hey, Kelly. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
There we go. I was having a bit of an audio issue. I couldn't hear anybody for the start of that. All right, guys. Thanks for joining us so much. Appreciate you guys being here. So today's webinar, we're going to talk a little bit technical at the beginning to go over some terms and technology setups that we see in networking pretty often, and really that's just meant to make sure all of our attendees and viewers are up to speed on some of the vocabulary that we're going to use to talk about networking wireless. So we're going to do about 10 or 15 minutes on just a basic intro to networking class of sorts to get you guys up to speed, and then following that, we'll dive into some real-world discussions on how these guys are using networking, why they're using it, where they're using it, and the workflow in which they find to be useful. So networking 101, quick explanation of terms. First off, I know it's super basic. It might be review for some of you, but what's an IP address? A unique string of numbers separated by periods that identifies each computer device using internet protocol. So my easy explanation for this is it's like the address at your house, right? The network's got to deliver mail. We have to deliver some packets of information just like we receive mail. So the first three sets of numbers I like to correlate to the state, city, and street. You can have multiple houses that are all in the same state, city, and street, but the final set of number is much like your house. Here's some slide reinforcement of what I was just talking about. Obviously, we know that the last set of numbers has to be unique. Sometimes this changes depending on advanced networking settings, but this is kind of the general idea of what we're talking about when we talk about an IP. Subnet mask, the number that reflects the range of IP addresses available inside a network is the pretty basic information there. So we're talking about networks and then hosts. Advanced networks, there can be multiple hosts and multiple networks, but if you're talking about a single network where you have an isolated set of network devices, we usually look at an IP address that looks something like this. To expand that network to more devices, more than 255, you would move that secondary or that second set of numbers to a 0 standpoint to open that up. So IP and subnet mask, DHCP versus static. What are these settings and what do they mean? So DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, dynamic being the main keyword there. And what that stands for or means is that you've got a server or a switch that is doling out the IP addresses automatically. So it's a technical device that's going to manage that. The DHCP server will automatically assign those addresses to populate your network, and sometimes those IP addresses will change based on the needs or as you add devices, hence the term dynamic. Static is where you provide a fixed IP address for every device manually. We see this in more complex networking environments. We also see it when we're adding our own external devices to a managed network like a venue or a broadcast truck. So sometimes we have to ask for a list of static IP addresses and make sure that we are not assigning an IP address that's already been used. Both of these have their pros and cons. Just wanted to get you guys up to speed on the terms that we might be using later on. So here's an example of a DHCP server. You can see that switch has got DHCP mode enabled, and we're doling out those IP addresses in numerical values. It doesn't always mean that they'll come out in order like this example shows, but it's just easier for a visual representation. Next up, we've got switched. Obviously, these are in somewhat of an order as well, but this would just be almost a dumb switch, and you would be automatically setting those settings on your devices, including default gateway. Axient Digital is kind of what we're going to focus on in terms of the wireless devices that we're networking. Axient Digital is equipped with a 4-port switch in the back that you see expanded upon here. There's four ports on the switch, 2 of them for control and wireless workbench. Those 2 ports have PoE, which is power over Ethernet, if you're unfamiliar with that term. And the other 2 are your Dante primary and Dante secondary ports. We can run this switch in 2 modes, switched or split and redundant. Switched means that all ports on that switch are connected, the unit's acting as a pass-through true switch. Redundant means that those are actually split, hence the split redundant naming terminology. So you're going to split your control 1, your control 2, your Dante 1, and your Dante 2. What does that look like when networked? Here is your single switched network. So this is just control into one switch. You could have multiple devices coming out of the 4-port switch on the Axient Digital there, and it would just pass that control network through. Redundant switched network, this is control only. So now you've got a control 1 and a control 2 on 2 separate switches, giving you redundant setup of your control. Here's a split redundant of your Dante only. A split redundant of control and Dante. And your fully split redundant network with 4 separate network switches and 4 separate networks for your control 1, control 2, Dante 1, and Dante 2. It is possible to have all of these on one managed switch. If you had a network engineer that was managing the ports on a switch, for visual representation, it's just easier to show you 4 different switches. If you are going to get into managed switching and running multiple networks on one switch, I suggest that you have a network engineer nearby. Okay, cool. So that's just our quick Network 101 intro. I think most of you may have already known that, but I wanted to make sure that those of you that were here that didn't, that we got you up to date on some of the terms we were going to talk about. So now I think we're going to open this discussion with Kelly and some of his use. Kelly, do you want to talk a bit about where your networking device is, and specifically, I think we spoke about some Yamaha integration in your world and how that flows.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks again for the opportunity to be with you, Jason. Love wireless. I've come to love networking in a love-hate relationship. I love to work, so therefore I will learn to love networking. The idea, with Axient Digital especially, early on in Axient and ULXD and even UHFRs, the idea of that interconnect in a single place to view everything is really important to me. So the network control was something that we always had an opportunity to do, and I always encouraged everybody on our crew to, whether I was mixing or whether I was the guy behind the rack or whether I'm specifying, I want a control network built, right? And I want to be able to monitor things. It's not that I doubt my RF coordinator. It's just that it helps me to have, kind of a heads up of where things are going, right? And kind of a look ahead in real time. So I'm a big Yamaha fan. I will tell you that most of the time I'm on a Yamaha desk, whether that's PM10, PM7, or a CL5. So I live a lot in that ecosystem, which means I'm living in Dante, right? And then with AD and ULXD, the Dante network obviously became a very big thing to integrate with the console. And then on top of that, when Yamaha said, hey, you know what, we can give you control via what you normally used as your gain knob as a way to control your output control of the receiver. I'm like, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. I have my microphones on the Dante network. I have the option of coming out of the analog output as well. So I have ability to have an analog backup. But I have single control, which was really big to me. And that slide that you had up earlier is it's a screenshot of the control. And I just would like to make a quick statement. This picture was taken with all necessary PP&E products on the individual's face and hands, and spacing was followed accordingly in order to get this picture. No consoles were hurt in the act. The idea being here, right, I got that out of the way now. You notice on here, there are 2 tabs for mixer control, for device control, right? So kind of that similar where we start thinking outside of a single Ethernet jack So for me, I see networking as an extension, and I think we'll continue to see this growth going forward. Both Shure and Yamaha have some great information on how to implement this. And I will tell you, full disclaimer, on site, as you're loading in, trying to be ready for a sound check, it's not the ideal time to be setting this all up. It's not hard, but it's not fast either. But I like that control, and to me, it represents kind of the forward where we're going. You know, Soundcraft has implementation of this as well. I would fully expect this in a lot of other ones, but if you're building your network anyhow, why not? Why not have this control for wireless Workbench channels and the console? You know, in the days when we had UHFR, and you know, as we moved into Axient, you know, we yelled into the receiver, found that deflection that everybody could live with. You could get into the companding argument at some point if you really wanted to, if you had a lot of time left over and something at lunchtime to yell about. But this idea of networking is not difficult on the surface, right? As your system size grows and the rest of these panelists, obviously the systems they're operating in, that complexity only goes up, right? When you get into the television production, the number of devices on this network and that management, it's a challenge, but by itself, in a standalone, you know, for those of you in a house of worship or in a around the AV industry and corporate events and special events, many times we have multiple networks, and that's quite fine. You know, putting everything on a single switch or two switches is not necessary for every single thing you do. It may be for a number of projects, but generally, letting Yamaha self-discover local link addressing, right, and the Shure devices, and you know, local link is when it just fails over. There's no DHCP server, right, where the devices just simply are built to when there's nothing else there to say, hey, I don't really know where I'm going. This is my address now, right? This is my house. So I tend to like to interconnect. These types of integrations don't create instability. You know, a lot of times, you know, that 4-switch picture you had up earlier, there's a lot of complexity there, right? And a lot of people are like, well, I want to be redundant. Well, I need to make sure I have redundancy on my redundancy. And at some point, right, where does it become almost more unstable, trying to find all these multiple redundant points? So that's the balancing act of networking, I think, in audio is always, you know, I have that saying of, you know, the simplest solution will ultimately be, no matter how complex it is, the simplest solution still wins, right? And that could mean that it's very difficult, but it's still going to be the simplest to accomplish it. So did I answer that question of how I use Shure and Yamaha?
I think so. I think that was quite the speech there, Kelly. Thank you. No, it's interesting to hear that, you know, you're integrating, and from a simplicity standpoint, that you're basically putting network control, Workbench, and Dante into what sounds like one stream, and that Yamaha's created a way to do that. And so when you talk about simple, I think that's a really good thing to talk about in networking. And I think what we're trying to hammer home, at least what I think we're talking about here, is how is networking helping your workflow? You know, we're in a workflow series for this webinar situation that we're doing for the month of May. And really the conversation I love to hear, which is what you just covered, is how is this helping your workflow? And what is it changing? So I guess my next question for you, Kelly, is have you seen any, I guess, what are the most common obstacles you've run into when networking your wireless and networking your gear together? And have you built some standards and practices to overcome that?
Well, those are great questions. Early on, yes, I would say it was very difficult because, you know, it was literally send somebody out to pick up a network switch because nobody had fiber, wasn't as prevalent as it was, right? And all of a sudden it's like, oh, You mean I can't go more than 300 feet or 100 meters on a Cat 5, right? So then it became grab a switch, right? So a lot of that has been overcome because most vendors are now packaging, whether it's wireless, whether it's their consoles, that those tools are packaged in there. If they're not, they really should be. It's not an option anymore. The one device that has absolutely nothing to do with networking, but I consider to be the most important device on a network is a UPS. That any device,
Great
especially
point.
if it has
Yeah.
Dante enablement and you're using that enablement, the UPS is almost a requirement, right? Because when if you lose power and it recycles, great, it's coming back up. And we always thought about it, the console. We thought about maybe for our matrix rack on our PLs, but certain key things as we enable more networking, that power becomes a big deal because when it recycles, it's going to take a little longer than the pop clicks and oh yeah, we're working again that analog had. Now the benefits, on the other hand, are numerous, right? So once I'm in Dante, I can send that signal to any one of these guys. If I'm on a show with these three gentlemen, I can mult that out multiple ways. Now, am I adding complexity? Sure, but one of the benefits of having that is I can go a lot of directions with it, so it brings a lot of benefit. I mentioned about the viewing remotely. What we can see, grade A2 is the one that's looking ahead, anticipating. If I'm out there mixing, that A2 is looking ahead in the future for me. And what tools are they using? Well, they're going to have to use Workbench. They're going to have to use channels. They're going to have to use whatever that platform is to help, if they're away from a rack, help me anticipate that. Now, can I see that on the console? That's why I started including that in my workflow, because I can get my RF level. I can see my audio. I don't have to be satisfied with, this median, okay, don't exceed, 2 or 3 greens, and maybe I get that one screamer up there that, we tried and as you guys know, in the live world, you get one shot, right? You don't get to go, okay, stop. All right, let's take that one again, right?
Yep.
So this control at my desk is vital, because does it mean that, that means that during sound check, I'm actually making an adjustment on that mic for the person that's going to be using the mic. Ideally, sometimes it's not, but I have control now. I have the ability to react to that and all the benefits that Dante bring me.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's a great time to segue over to the fantastic A2s we have on this call, BK and Steve Anderson and Steve Vaughn over there. Before we dive into asking you guys some questions, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you have a question that you want answered, please drop that into the question chat that you have on your webinar control panel. We do have some people in the background, Eric Reese and Ben and Jen from earlier, and Sam Bisak, and I think Bill Austree's on here trying to get to your questions, as well as take a couple of them live. So please put your questions in there if you have them. Moving forward, I guess Steve and BK, Steve's and BK, to open this up, I think it was a really good transition there from Kelly in terms of what are you guys networking, and what do your network positions look like on these shows, and how has that changed over the last couple of years to help you with your workflow as an A2 on some of these larger broadcast shows?
I think we should start really with Steve Vaughn and Bill Kappleman on that, and they're more the ones that are the hands-on setting up the network and knowing technically what's going on. I can
He's
be
such a
more of
manager.
Transition for the win.
Delegating
Well,
still.
a little bit better with the broad
as far
picture.
as the vendor standpoint, having the wireless workbench tool for programming the RFs, managing what's on each unit, it's vital. Very important to have all of your systems networked. And I also like having the automatic IPs, just because if I'm not there as a vendor, somebody can just plug into their network and automatically have their unit assigned to the workbench. And as Kelly pointed out earlier, the remote viewing is very important to manage these systems and observe them in real time. And Mr. Kappleman can speak on that. I usually have a setup for him that we used in the Grammys and for other shows that we've worked together on in the past. Excuse me. So as far as that is concerned, I think having a network that I've never had really that many problems with. Once in a while we'll have a computer issue where, if you don't have your updates shut off, where it'll automatically update in the middle of a live show, that could be a problem. So make sure you check your computer settings
That's a great point.
on what you're using, because that can be an issue where all of a sudden you're in the middle of something and then all of a sudden your computer's asking for an update, and that's not a good thing. So anyway, I'll digress to Mr. Kappleman there and see if he has any comments on observing the workbench.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us this morning and this evening or this afternoon, wherever the hell you are.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, it's a matter of location and size, I think. Size because on live shows, we're dealing with such a huge number of receivers and microphones and then hence receivers that, constantly turning back, to look and seeing if the receivers are physically located near you is hard. Just to have on one big screen, every single RF that you have, because one of your 8 mixers, up to 8 mixers, might be screaming, "I lost RF 14," and I can immediately look up on the screen and see, okay, do I have RF? Do I have audio? Do I have battery? Obviously, I can get an immediate graphical representation of what's going on with that receiver. Now, for location, Steve and I frequently will work Steve Vaughn and I will work side by side, but many times, like at ACMs in Vegas, MGM Grand, Steve Vaughn is up on another level above me. We can barely shout to each other, let alone, hey, how's RF14? So he will throw me one of the control Cat 5s, and I'll hook it up to a monitor, and we'll have a nice day. So we've been doing that for a good number of years, using a single RJ45 in Ethernet cable just to get wireless Workbench going. So having
Awesome.
those factors, having those aids, let alone the fact that we're managing, up to 72 microphones.
It's a real world workflow. Absolutely. Yeah, I think you guys were kind enough to send me some photos. So I think I'm going to drop those in here now just for like a bit of visual aid here. Bill, do you want to talk about a little bit here what we're looking at on the screen here in terms of a networked workstation?
Sure. It's on my left, but sadly it's a photo of me. I'm sorry about that. This is for Rent Live down at Fox Studios. We did a year and a half ago, I guess, something like that. So I'm under the bleachers there, out of the way. Steve Anderson's not too far from me, and Steve Vaughn, I think, is 180 degrees behind me. But I have right in front of me everything I need, right? One thing we haven't talked about, if you see above me there, you'll see a Workbench Manager. But to my right is a product called Waves. What that does is that takes network to one more level. That takes the information from Steve Vaughn's receivers via Cat 5, and then it integrates an audio source, and it's usually a MADI signal that's most handy to us. And MADI's got up to 64, I guess, on audio channels. And what it does is it's hard to tell there, but there's a box for every single receiver, and it's got RF signal strength, it's got audio, it's got battery. And if I push it, I can hear the audio. And for me, that's the single best thing ever. I mean, I just have died and gone to heaven, because I don't have to jack in with a headphone, to hear. I just push. My job on these musicals is RFQC. The A1s are not able to PFL the sources because their script is 300 pages, so they're just barely keeping up with faders, let alone PFLing to see what something's going to sound like coming up. So my job is to look at a script and get ahead and making sure that it sounds right and work with the other A2s. If we need a battery change, I hear some rustling, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then on the right is just a close-up version of that.
As a networking standpoint, point, that system that he's talking about is a static system. So you got to make sure that you assign your IP addresses and your subnet masks to those both systems if you're using both in conjunction, like we did in this instance. Actually, there's 3 different wireless management systems in there, or Workbench as well. So there you got the Sennheiser, and then Workbench, and then you have the Waves as well. Or is it Waves? What is? I forget the name of it.
Is it Wave
Yeah.
Tool?
Waves. Wave Tool.
Yeah,
Is it
Wave
Wave
Tool.
Tool, BK? Is that what you're talking about? Wave Tool?
I think that's the name. Yeah.
I believe
Yeah.
that's correct. Yeah. We've had a couple questions come in on that. The software is called Wave Tool. I think one of us might be able to drop a link in the chat here. Oh, there we go. Jen's got it. Jen and Ben, you read my mind. Fantastic.
You know, Wave
So-
Tool is an incredible tool, and it's doing what what people in Bill Kappleman's position really need. For me, more of a wide picture management and logistics standpoint, wireless Workbench to do remote viewing has become something that would be hard to do these shows without. The fact that you can run a Cat 5 somewhere and throw down a computer and see ballistics of the whole system but as far as using wireless Workbench to control settings, we're very in live television. You know, it's important everywhere to make sure that failure is a minimum, but the price you pay in live television if you lose 30 seconds is devastating. If you're in an arena show and you have to delay a show by 5 minutes, it's not financially devastating. So with us, very often, people ask why we're so behind the curve on bringing in new technologies, and that's the exact reason. Is that one, schedule-wise, if you look at a show like the Grammys, we go into an empty arena, and 6 days later we do the show and take it out that night. So now all of a sudden you need time to set up or futz with or learn about, we just don't have that kind of time in a schedule. So with that Waves device, you know, it takes a little while to get it up and running. And so it's been hard in the award shows to use that system. But again, in shows like the live Broadway shows that we do to television, we find the time because it's such an important tool. And we usually, you know, depending on the show, when we did Little Mermaid live last year, we did it all in about a week. But when we did Rent, we were involved in rehearsals from day one as soon as talent walked on the set. So we were actually there for almost a month. So, you know, when you have a month doing a show, or if you're in a permanent install or a place of worship, or where things are more stable and you're not breaking every rack down every single 5 days and moving it to some new venue, protecting yourself from having the device make changes to your RFs while in a show. Get familiar with it. Make sure you can shut that part off once you're in a show. When it comes to networking audio, we've been dragging our feet a lot in that, and this year was the first year on the Grammys where we used Dante on all of the RFs, and it was a pretty intense system, and it was not Dante to end users. It was Dante from the RFs to Splitland, which is kind of my house, and then it became Dante to MADI converters, and all mixers took everything via MADI. It was scary because, again, in Steve and Bill's and my heads, dealing with failure quickly is huge, and we do things that mixers don't know about because it would scare them. And one of the things we do is we have a super secret of every type of RF that's not slated anywhere. And, you know, in a moment's notice without analog.
Not a secret now.
Yeah.
Not a secret
you know,
now.
an RF rolls under the stage, and in moments it can get communicated from the stage to us, and we can react. And usually in the past, it would be, I simply unplug the microphone that rolled under the stage, plug in a super secret, and that thing gets run out as fast as possible. And hopefully we get there before the top of a song. With dealing with Dante, all of a sudden, you have a large group of people that cup microphones and scream in them, and then when the song's over, they're all so jacked up they scatter to the wind, and all of a sudden you lose a mic that's slated in 5 minutes from now to be used for somebody else. And how do you react in Dante versus reacting in analog? And the people that were really managing the Dante network for us, one of the first things that we all came up with is, once we were in dress rehearsal, there would be no more changes to the Dante network. And of course, if we needed to, we would have done something up to showtime. But realistically, at this point, everybody's afraid of making changes to the Dante network once we are in a show. So now how do you react to failures? Doing it the old analog way, mixers wouldn't even know a failure happened. Now, all of a sudden, you're communicating to mixers that instead of opening RF1, they have to go to RF64, the backup to the backup's backup, and getting them all to react and open that mic up in time. And it doesn't seem to work real well a lot of the times. So wrapping our heads around the Dante side and how to deal with the Dante side when a failure happens has been something that we aren't real comfortable with yet.
And you might mention that because we weren't that comfortable, we also ran analog, so we ran both Dante and analog for the Grammys this year. Yeah,
I was just right, and you have a full analog backup for that show.
Full analog.
Yeah, full analog backup, and all mixers were told if there's a failure, we're going to say go to analog. So you better have in your B-side input on every channel, you better have the analog equivalent, because that would be our first go-to every single time.
Gotcha.
We never had to do it.
I was going to say, that was the next question. Did you have any issues? I assumed not, but
no, it all worked. And one of the things I was so interested in is okay, we're upsetting this whole machine we've done for years of how to deal with these kinds of failures, and now what's the payoff? What are we doing this for? And so I was very interested in speaking to all the mixers and saying that the decision to go was driven by Eric Schilling, who had done other shows with Dante, and he loved the way that it sounded, and to him there was a big difference. Now, if you went around to all the mixers, I would say that everybody felt sonically it was an improvement, but the more esoteric the mixer, the more the improvement. If you're talking about the monitor mixers, they're just glad to have artists walk off the stage without throwing something at them. They thought it was, it was all right, whatever. But if you're dealing with somebody who's very esoteric out in the recording truck, who's got a field of producers and a whole bunch of talent in with them, they thought that it made a large improvement.
Except, Steve, remember that the production A1 did not think there was improvement with Dante. He chose the analog.
That is true. Yeah. And that's because his mind was more wrapped around the idea of failure than the idea of a small improvement. The music mixers, again, they're focused on their task, and it feels on that show more like a studio situation up there than a television situation. So to them, yeah, it meant more.
Great info. Awesome. Thanks for that, Steve. I want to bring this back a little bit. We had some questions about the photos I was sharing a moment ago in terms of BK's location, and essentially the question was, in these photos that I had showed up here, we don't visibly see any RF racks, and I think we touched on it a little bit. But Steve Vaughn and BK, do you guys want to talk about a little bit more in depth some examples of where the RF racks live? I know we mentioned the MGM. And the ACMAs and that two-story thing, but maybe go over that again and how far away RF racks can be from a monitoring station.
It depends on the stage plot, really. It just depends on what real estate they left for the A2s and where they can operate and where they have the equipment and where our RFs are in relation to to split world, which Dante would open up a new window for that. It wouldn't matter really. But in most cases, we still use analog systems, especially during a live show, like Steve was mentioning, Steve Anderson. So a lot of times we'll just, it depends. Sometimes we're right next to each other, but, and that's usually the case. The A2s like to be able to physically look over and see the rack, but as time goes by and they're more familiar with the software and using Wireless Workbench, the better. One thing I do suggest is putting it in monitor only. A lot of times, if you have a touch screen and you actually point at the RF that you're using, you can mute it. So just a little tip. You can actually make changes using a touch screen device, which is advantageous if you have a Surface or an iPad or something that you're using a Workbench, and you can go ahead and use a stylus and make changes to your receivers and transmitters if you're using I keep forgetting the name of it. System monitor? No. What is it? You can change transmitters with the device.
Link.
Showlink. God, I keep forgetting the name of it.
No Shure shirt for
Yeah,
you.
I know. Sorry about that.
Steve, there's a whole webinar on it in 2 weeks.
I know. I've used it many times. I'm sorry. I don't know why. It's
Just quickly, Steve's talking about putting your wireless workbench into monitor only mode. That's in tools, and it's almost the last one you can see on the screen. When you select that option, you'll notice this lock in the bottom right goes to monitor only mode. And what that basically does is it just gives you a monitor screen. You can't effectively change anything. And so a lot of installations I've seen, especially for some of these award shows that you guys are doing, it is a touch screen down there, and that can be useful in rehearsals and for building your layout. What you see here is, I believe this is the Grammys file that you sent me, Steve Vaughn.
yes.
Thank you for that. And so essentially come showtime, or maybe even before, if you've got distributed monitors of your wireless workbench to multiple people, it might be a good idea to put those into monitor only, because you could essentially accidentally hit one of these mute buttons, and that would effectively mute that RF on accident. There's one other thing I want to mention real quick. We have this open and I can take it out of monitor only. You can also get rid of that mute button. So if you right click and go to Monitor Widget Designer, you could get rid of the mute button, so receiver transmitter control. So that's one other functionality. If you wanted to leave some control for somebody, but you didn't want them to have that mute button on the channel strip, just another workflow item. But great point. Thanks for bringing that up, Steve.
And again, for a live show, it should be monitor only for everybody except for the one person. And realistically, on the shows we're talking about right now, that person would be Steve Vaughn. Bill Kappleman or myself, who are remoted somewhere else, we shouldn't be able to do anything on that screen to those RF receivers. It should only be one person, and that would be Steve Vaughn, who's the head RF engineer on the show.
Respect.
And they were asking about where the racks,
It's all
where the receivers are.
Oh, where the racks are. The receivers, they can be anywhere now. With remote viewing, they can be anywhere. So it becomes a logistical question. Where can we fit them? Where can we put them? Where can we still make quick patches in them? So sometimes it's upstairs. Sometimes it's stage left, where the A2 table is stage right. So it just, with remote viewing, it becomes very secondary. You still need to have access to it to respond to situations, but it doesn't need to be, well, there's a good picture.
There's Steve Vaughn.
Yeah. So that looks like it's
usually not that relaxed.
There's the racks. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you look at that picture, the picture on the right, with Steve on the left smiling at us, and then all the racks, the third rack over you see there, that's the Dante interface rack. So, and then just to the right of that is where Bill Kappleman's sitting at his QC table. Bill on these shows is QC, as well as helping the A2s that are placing microphones on stage. doing head changes. The logistics of head changes and manufacturer types, and whether it's it just goes on and on and on. So a lot of times, like on this show, we had around 60 mics. A large number of those mics went through 4 head changes during the show. So what's this one?
These
The
are
mic
two,
grid that BK sent me.
yeah. This is a very small show, but just some example of what we might start an award show, small award show with.
Yeah.
Allotment of Shure's, allotment of Sennheisers.
Yeah. The other
And then
thing
it
with
builds from
remote
there.
viewing, speaking of Sennheiser, we don't want to, not in the real world, we do deal with multiple vendors, multiple companies. And with remote viewing, you do need to find the, I don't remember what Sennheiser's is called, but every manufacturer has their own version. So you need to open a window of Sennheiser's and a window of Shure's.
Yeah, I believe you can see that here in this right photo, top left.
Yeah,
Yep.
Yep, that's it exactly. Yep.
That is one advantage of the Waves system as well. Is it doesn't matter what kind of RF unit it is.
It's agnostic.
But the diagnostic on it isn't as intuitive, or not as intuitive, but it's not as detailed as their own softwares are. Such as WSM or Wireless Workbench.
Great.
In terms of speed, but in terms of speed and responding, it's unbelievably quick.
That's awesome.
It is real time.
So you mentioned that program requires static IPs, correct, Steve?
That is correct. Yeah.
So does that mean that you static IP'd all of your RF racks manually?
Yeah, we had to. Well, I mean, you can. Yeah, you had to. It was fun. It was a lot of fun.
No, it wasn't.
I've sat many times during lunch changing all of the IPs on the racks to make that system work. Yes.
So I guess workflow. I got a couple questions to that topic. One, were you using Wireless Workbench to type IP addresses in, or were you using the scroll knob on the front to do them through that method?
At the time, we were using the scroll knob for some of that, but you can. It's a lot easier to go into to Workbench and do that. But at the time, we just weren't doing that, so we just did it by hand and scrolled each one in through the front panel. And it also sometimes it just reduces the amount of confusion when you have that many. Going. It's like, which one did we just do? If you're physically at the unit, where you're at.
Just top to bottom from the rack. Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes sense. And you had multiple brands in there, so you could only do half the rack or so.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
So we would just sit there and just do one at a time right there from the rack.
And then in terms of, because it was static, did you have a dedicated person or network manager that had a list of those static IP addresses?
No, we didn't. We didn't go quite that far as in detail. We just knew basically what network they were in, and we would just number them in order.
Awesome.
So you would know it would be like, the subnet mask would be 0001, and then you would go 002, 003, and then so on. So you knew exactly which one's which. And especially with that Waves, it's important with the audio portion, the Dante portion of that, or the Maddie. I think it uses Maddie. Yeah, Maddie. That that you don't confuse what RF is on what audio portion, because you can actually have the wrong audio on an RF unit if you don't assign it properly.
Sounds fun.
It's a useful tool if you
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds awesome.
It's a useful tool, but learn it real well in the shop, or learn it real well when stay at lunch and play with it. Do whatever, but don't try learning it on the show, because it can burn you. Right.
Hey, Kelly, we had a question that came through a little bit earlier that I kind of wanted to pivot to about the Yamaha control. For Yamaha control on ULXD, the control network has to be the same as the Dante primary network. Is that correct?
Correct. That's just pulling up the sheet here, but it looks like that is correct statement for the ULXD. Okay. Right. So it just rides on the Dante network with that.
Great. Just wanted it.
And I think you have a link for that too. A lot of good
do.
stuff out there.
I will pull that up here in a moment. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Great, guys. So looking forward here, well, we can go back as well. I guess what from a Grammy standpoint, what would you say was the biggest hurdle from a network standpoint that you guys had to get over collectively as a team? And do you believe that it was worth it to have the red network flow in place? Do you think you'll go back to that?
I think with any technologies that are a clear move forward for the whole entire audio world, it's hard to go backwards. So I don't see us going backwards. We would have had to make it fail a lot more, and it didn't fail at all.
It didn't fail.
Sabotage it, yeah. It didn't fail. It worked very, very well. Again, I going back and mentioning it again, how to react to failure and have everybody on board the team know how you're going to react to failure, because it is a whole different mindset on troubleshooting and on reacting. You know, somebody comes, you have a receiver fail in the middle of a show, you can't just pull that receiver out and plug in a new one. You're now back to having to get all the mixers to react to a different channel being somewhere else. And that's not easy to do. On the Grammys, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 mixers. So between front of house, music production, stage left monitors, stage right monitors, production mixer out in the truck, and then an A stage music mixer and a B stage music mixer. To get everybody, everybody is so into the show at that point, and once something goes wrong, everybody starts communicating at the same time. Getting them in the middle of a show to react, it's logistically more difficult than it sounds.
Absolutely.
These photos are more towards my side of the Grammys. You can see the RedNet interfaces, and then we had a little Digico console. Whoop. Analog phone. How does that work?
Whoa.
As if I'm cute. Old school, baby.
Hey.
The way God intended voice to be.
Yeah, the way for us to monitor audio is easiest by dropping another small console, independent. It doesn't matter who the manufacturer was. We even over in Splitland, which the picture on the right is down in Splitland, so that's about 150 feet away from Bill Kappleman in the RF racks, and that rack on the right is my Dante rack and Dante to MADI converters. And then just to the left of that, you can see what are those? Oh, those are the interface to the production truck.
The Hydras. Yeah.
The Hydras.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Awesome.
So on that one shot, you're looking at analog, you're looking at fiber connectivity, you're looking at Dante, and you're looking at MADI.
Yeah. Yes.
And we have to massage all of that.
Which is not unusual for sure.
Nowadays.
Well, and the key for somebody like me is to be supported by an incredible group of engineers. Hugh Healy out in the truck is just a genius, and all the way across, the more support you have, the better off you're going to be.
Awesome.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. We had a question come through, Steve Vaughn. This might be a little bit more prevalent for you, and maybe not quite as fitting for a show like the Grammys because it's a bunch of different people come together. But how long do you typically take in a shop to pre-network route and test before a large event?
Wow, that's a good question. It depends on how many people you can dedicate to that one project. Usually something the size of the Grammys or something like that, it would take at least 2 to 3 days. And in this case, it took 2 days or 3 days for them to prep the rack. And then on site, I'm also making changes. So it never really settles in until just before the show. So you really, you can prepare all you want, but it'll constantly change. So you have to be ready for that anyway. So I would just say as much preparation as you can. I mean, if you can dedicate a week to it, do it. I mean, from the frequency plan to testing every single microphone, every single element, every single aspect, every RF cable,
Yep.
BNC cables to make sure everything's working. And audio wise, if you got W2 or whatever kind of analog system, or if you're using the Dante network, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and hook up the primary and secondary networks yourself and test it with your own Audinate program there, in shop, and make sure by the time your client or whoever gets the rack, it's just plug and play for them. So that's the idea.
On a lot of the shows we do, there's multiple vendors. So on like the Grammys, we keep using the Grammys as our reference. Audio Tech did all of the Dante MADI interface stuff. Some of it came from the video truck, but Audio Tech set the full thing up about a week ahead of time. And I know that Jeff Peterson, who's an amazing engineer and another one of those geniuses that is a amazing person to have on your team, they were there fooling with it for multiple days. Once they had it all built and set up, they were just making sure that they could run it and they were going to be able to get it up. They had mock-ups of every Dante console and everything, so they pretty much set the whole thing up in the shop ahead of time.
To this point, and I'm not sure based on what we've learned here if you guys will know the specific answer to this, but do you know how many Dante receivers you had pulling out of each mic input? And did you have to use multicast flows in your Dante routing? Okay.
Well, I think the answer, from what I saw, like Steve mentioned, it was Audio Tech and Jeff Peterson who put that together. But yeah, they had the primary and secondary networks completely going to multiple locations. So I would think yes. I would think they would have it,
I would imagine they were using multicast. Yeah.
Yeah, I would imagine. I mean,
I could ping Peterson a bit later and
according to Dante, anything if you exceed 4, technically 3, you want to go to multicast versus unicast for traffic.
Yeah, it was
I would think so.
Yeah, it's most likely multicast for that size of network.
Great question, by the way. Thank you guys for asking that. As mentioned in the chat and earlier, if you guys have any questions, please fire them in here. We are pushing up to an hour. I know some of us have committed to stay a little bit longer to get through the Q&A. We'll kick it up with this one. Are there security and encryption options on Wireless Workbench, or can anyone with a laptop plug into the network and see everything?
I believe in the question they referenced ULXD. ULXD does not have this feature, but Axient Digital does have the ability to set a PIN. And if you do set a PIN, anyone who connects to that gear in Workbench is going to get asked for the PIN. They'll still be able to see the gear and monitor it, but they won't be able to get in and control or make any changes without that PIN code.
Or if you're really worried about that, you can just go static network and no one can access it unless they know what your IP addresses are.
Great point. It's another level. Absolutely. Cool. Let's see. Do you guys know if Dante Domain Manager was used at the Grammys, the software DDM?
It was. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Good question.
By ATK, as Steve Anderson referenced.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep banging through here. Okay, might be a better question for Music A2, but I'm sure you guys can answer. For guitarists who have mini guitars, maybe a touring question. Do they use the same receiver and a bunch of transmitters all set to the same frequency, or is there a different receiver for every guitar?
Not a different receiver for every guitar. It's usually a couple of RFs that are getting
Right.
transmitters that are getting turned on and off going to. And to go for a little bit further with that, part of what we have established is that any RFs that are going from an instrument not being passed through an amplifier on stage or an effects unit on stage is usually being taken care of by the A2s, and is in part of our spreadsheet and logistics of how we do the show. And anything that is on stage and anything that would then be through Steve Vaughn's antenna system and everything. But as soon as you need to have a guitar amp or effects pedals, then that becomes a remoted receiver out on stage with the amp. If that made sense, I guess it kind of did.
Yeah, totally. We've seen some interesting workflows on this exact topic, especially with ShowLink mentioned earlier from Steve Vaughn, and the ability to remotely RF mute from your monitor page if you have a ShowLink and ADX transmitter. So we're seeing some tours where the guitar tech's actually going to RF mute that from software during a guitar change and unmute the next guitar as it goes out without actually having to physically do anything to the pack. So we're seeing that adopted.
And again, in a long run show, in a tour, in a permanent install,
Right.
I think that's brilliant, and that's the kind of thing that they can do. But on a one-off that's a slam it in, slam it out, it's just another point of failure. So I would be, unless you're really, really good at doing it and understanding it, I would shy away from that.
Very good point.
I have a question for Steve Vaughn. Do you use for frequency coordination, do you use IAS or do you use Workbench?
I right now predominantly use IAS just because it's got a few more options. Shure is working on it, which I really appreciate what they've done. And you know, their software doesn't cost any money, as where the other one does.
So there's the plug.
There is
their stuff is
it's
free.
a useful tool for free. I mean, you can use it and you can coordinate and put your how well you want it to avoid frequencies. If you want to go all the way to fifths and see if you want to avoid that and have the most wide use of the spectrum, just it's available to you.
And when you say fifths, you mean fifth harmonics and not fifth of whiskey,
absolutely.
right?
Well, depends.
Might be
what
both.
You're up for. Yeah, maybe both.
That's awesome. Nice question, BK. We are getting quite a few from the audience here, so if you guys don't mind, we'll keep banging through some of these. Awesome.
Sure.
Question from Asaro: how involved and what kind of input do you consider from the A1 or people mixing the shows in terms of your workflow?
Steve Anderson.
It all depends on the show and the situation. There's certain mixers on certain shows that dedicate, they say this mic is for this person, blah, 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 blah. On the larger live award shows, it usually comes down to the coordinator and the lead A2, majority of the times the lead A2. And whoever's getting all the band information as for pre-production, they give me notes directly and Steve Vaughn directly that this person's coming, they're bringing their own transmitter, it's going to be in this range, or this person's coming, they need this kind of transmitter, but they're bringing their own head. And we do a large grid of every single microphone and every single performance. And when you lay it out in a grid form, it makes it very fast to react to all of a sudden you're about to rehearse the last act and they want to add 6 background vocals. You can see logistically very quickly on a grid what's available and what's not. You can see traps that you've built into your organization that way.
Awesome. Kelly, I feel like you might have some input on this in terms of A1 input?
Oh, well, it depends on what the show is. I mean, what these guys are talking about, when you're mixing, that's you got your head in the game. This is something where this is why you have the team you have around you, because you need those people to pick up what that distraction might be, and get the essentials. It's kind of like when you fly. If you listen to a pilot, the information they might be getting from the tower, right? It's straight. It's very straightforward, minimal as possible, because your mind is on the show that you're doing. So, and depending, again, a lot of it is based around complexity of what's going on. I do like to be in the loop, but at the same time, I rely heavily on the crew around me to make that decision that, if you're listening to the PL chatter going on and what the show is going on at that very moment, you better pick wisely, because it's a good way to lose a finger real fast or a head, depending on where you bite first.
I've worked with some mixers that all the way down to transmit level, they are trying to dictate from behind the console. And in situations like that, I'll step in and say, realistically, Bill Kappleman and Steve Vaughn are in the position of knowing the information to set those levels. After that, there's this little knob at the top of your console. You turn it clockwise, things get louder.
You're in full control right there, aren't you?
Yeah.
Wait, Steve, which way do we go?
Counterclockwise, Bill. Counterclockwise.
I would say that the answer to that question is probably a large part of the reason why you guys are sitting here, in terms of the A1 not necessarily having to come to you for some of the things that he shouldn't have to, depending on the situation. So
we joked around a little bit earlier about if the A1s knew what was actually going on and what we had to do to get a show on, they would be so nervous they wouldn't be able to mix the show. So it depends on the A1. A really confident A1 who is very confident in their team knows what it is they should worry about and not worry about, and they don't have a problem handing off those decisions to us. Again, part of my job ends up being sometimes stepping into the middle of this and saying, no, this is how we're going to do it. And in most shows, not all, it depends on the mixers and everything. Again, we're a team. We're not really, there's no, the mixer's always looked at as the head of the team. But if you have a good A2 that knows what's going on your stage, you should trust them. And if you need an explanation, then it's going to take way too long and the moment's passed.
Great point.
So it's a give and take.
While we're on this topic, and I know it's an interesting question, but there might be a lot of people here that don't know. Can you guys give me a quick definition of A1 and A2? Some people are asking.
You know what? Their union designations is where the names come from. So out here, IOTC Local 695 is it's the film. I don't remember what we are actually, but it's a film-based local that crosses over into most of the television work on the West Coast. And A1 is a mixer designation, and an A2 is a stage assistant. So me as a lead A2 would be the guy in charge on stage of all the other A2s. But on these shows, the audio department on stage gets broken down into many different departments. There's the monitor department. The monitor department breaks it down to guys on stage that are dealing with hard wires and guys that are dealing with in-ears. And so there's it gets so broken down on the large shows to multiple departments within the department. But basically, A1 is the head of the department, is the mixer of the show, and A2 would be the stage assistants.
And another definition of A2 is audio utility.
There we go. Nice. Just for reference, real quick, how many A2s and A1s would you say were on the Grammys?
I don't have enough appendages.
Let's put it this way, that on the first day at the Grammys, we always have a large meeting that involves almost everybody in the audio department, and there's probably about 40 people in that room.
Wow.
I'd say we counted. we counted mixers, and mixers were 7, and those are guys directly behind consoles. Each mix position has a tech. On stage A2 wise for the Grammys, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or 10 people with assistance from local 33 people, which is the West Coast stagehands local. So we always share jurisdiction on these shows, and about 10 from local 695 and about 10 from local 33. What were we talking about? We were talking about how many people on the show.
Right.
So
Yeah, artists bring their own too.
every artist brings their own, and those technicians interface with us. And on stage doing RFs for production is 2 to 3 people. People on stage doing RFs for music is 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5 people.
Wow.
Yeah, we have a meeting
that's a big show.
that Steve referenced. We have this big meeting, 40 to 50 of us that first morning, and we're handed my first Grammy. I was handed an empty binder. Oh, this is nice. This is my little souvenir binder. And then paperwork just kept coming and kept coming and kept coming. And for 6 days, it's all paperwork, and it still is that way. But there were people that would be at that meeting, audio in my own department, audio for the Grammys, and I would never see or hear from them for the rest of the show.
Wow.
It's that first morning, yeah, because they're in a truck, half a mile away that's doing one thing. They're somewhere else, so it's a big undertaking, huge.
Fiber.
I was always taught when I started that you're only as good as your notes and you're only as good as your paperwork. So ahead of time, you need paperwork so that everybody knows what the plan is when you walk in the door. And once you're starting rehearsals, you need to be able to keep your notes. You need to have, depending on what position it is, you need to have a system of keeping notes. I have a huge system that I use because I'm doing a whole lot of cross patching, single XL cross patching during the show. We go to a remote little stage out in the house. That's all cross patches back at Splitland. So you can only do a show well if you can keep notes well and then repeat your notes on a very.
I just use Steve's notes.
I will. Smart. By the time I'm doing notes and handing them out to all the A2s over and over again, which that could be another subject of a webinar. How to do notes. We're having a very hard time making our note taking being electronic. All the people physically on the stage, we have a real hard time getting rid of that wad of paper we can fold in half and stick in our back pocket. Carrying around something and now trying to pick up 3 mic stands is not as easy as it sounds. So we're still on paper for the most part.
Good to know.
Analog.
We've done more and more stuff.
Man. Yep.
Yeah. We've done more and more now. The mixers are better at it. The people that are sitting at a permanent location are better at learning how to use whatever system you use.
Great.
Electronic. But the guys running around on stage, it's hard. I've bought 4 iPads saying that I'm going to convert, and each one of them have gone out of date, and I still haven't.
We had a nice comment from the field said the batteries in paper never die.
Yeah, they never do.
Quick question on this paperwork topic. What's your labeling system like for audio ports, cables, and even more so, how about network connections? Are you guys labeling your network connections, and what does the labeling system look like?
It looks like paper and a Sharpie. I mean, paper tape and a Sharpie. You know what? It depends on the level of organization walking in. Again, going to the Grammys, just because it's one of the more difficult ones we do. We get there, and Mike Abbott is the audio coordinator, and he's very, very, very well organized when we walk in the door. We've got a 2-page grid of what we call big pre-cable runs. So it's 70 big cables that we probably put in on cable day. And I wish that I could have an example to show, but yeah, it's basically just a grid of and naming the cables, all of the cables that go to the A stage or that are associated with the A stage start with an A, and then we give them an A1, A2, A3, A4 designation. And everything with a B stage starts with a B. C is usually the RF, so everything that starts with a C has something to do with the RFs. D usually has everything to do with high-level returns.
Although nowadays, at the Grammys, it was Dante. Remember, we used D.
Oh, yeah.
So we had a C1, RF1 was a C or a D1, and the mixers had to have both landed.
Awesome. Kelly, anything to note there on what are you doing for labeling?
You know, I think I concur. It's, you know, Sharpie and board tape is not going anywhere anytime soon. Even when I save my scenes, I still have paper tape that I lay on my desk for every single scene.
I think there's just one more question that we've got flagged that I want to jump into. That's a good question about the award show thing. Are artist engineers allowed to mix their own artist?
I would say that in the majority of cases, no. One of the things that audio tech does quite a bit, and different companies embrace it different ways, and they are a Digico company, and they share the front end cages amongst all mixers. So it's very hard for, if all the mixers are under the thumb of audio tech and the production company, it can work quite well. But if all of a sudden you have a wild card stepping in, they can pretty much, you know, depending on who has control of mic pre's and so forth, it can be a bad idea. But that being said, you know, sometimes I'll mix front of house over at Jimmy Kimmel for Bill Kappleman. And when they come, you know, you feel it out. If you know the person and you know their level, it's one thing. But realistically, at that point, we're there to look out for the interest of the production company and the production. They're there to look for the interest of the one artist. So
right.
Guess what? They're going to do anything in their power to make their one artist happy when push comes to shove, where we're going to do anything in our power to make the big picture happen. And so and then, you know, you can go into union rules about it in a union house, blah, 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 which, you know, whatever on that. I'm not a big stickler for that. But I would say in the majority of cases, you should look at yourself as a liaison that's there looking out for the interest of your artist. You should look at yourself, if you're a front of house person, as that you're producing that one. You should make a good relationship with whoever that mixer is so that you can communicate with them clearly and quickly. You know, some guys come in and they look at what we take for a sound check and they're dumbfounded. You know, we will go from an empty stage to a line check in 10 minutes. We'll be done with the line check for a 50 input band in less than 5 to 10 minutes, and we'll be into the sound check, and they'll run it once for us. And at that point, production and stage managers are freaking out, telling us that we're making them behind schedule, when realistically it was a million other things before we got to this point that made them behind schedule. But now it's us at the end. So we'll do there's times where we don't even do a single pass for audio, and we're running the song for camera. And
Wow.
so if you can't dial up a mix in an incredibly fast, it would be a problem. So look at yourself as a producer. You're producing for your artist walking into this situation, and you should be able to tell your monitor mixer or your front of house mixer exactly what you want. Monitor mixing, it's a little bit different. You know, again, it's situation driven, but a lot of times, if you're a monitor mixer that's been working with this artist for a long time, you can fly on the console so much faster than a really good person is working with this artist for the first time. So I'd say much more often in monitor mixing, but very often monitor mixers, they're not allowed to touch the consoles either in these situations.
Great answer. Awesome. Well, guys, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Real quick, some more housekeeping. If you weren't here at the beginning, we've got 3 more of this workflow series this month, every Friday. So the 15th is going to be battery workflow. The 22nd is going to be show link, remote control, Steve Vaughn. And the 29th is going to be mic capsule shootout. We're going to have some awesome guests for all 3 of those, just like we did today. Again, Bill Kappleman, Steve Anderson, Steve Vaughn, Kelly Epperson. You guys were fantastic today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank
you
for
very
having
much.
us.
One last
What's up,
plug.
Jen?
Yeah.
Kelly Epperson is doing a fair amount of webinars right now
That he
for
is.
practical show tech. So they're amazing. So definitely check them out as well.
At practicalshowtech.com, 4 o'clock today, Eastern time. Jesse will be on the Fiber Guy talking about
Nice.
fiber maintenance.
Awesome.
Sorry, I can't.
The
Fiber
microscope.
Friday.
Get the microscope.
That's it, man. Clean it out. Fire it up. Thanks for that, Jen. Nice reminder. He's doing some awesome stuff as well. So again, thank you guys. Everybody have a wonderful Friday. Enjoy your weekends, and I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
So long.